We're potentially 2 weeks away from Starship's next launch. That's right, we now have a possible date for what will be the final launch of the current generation of ships, boosters, and the pad itself. With both stages having completed pre-launch testing ahead of Flight 11, SpaceX now appears to be taking a moment to thoroughly prepare everything ahead of launch. At the same time, testing continues for Starship's next chapter, with a new test tank going through cryogenic proof testing over at the Massey outpost, and even more testing of Pad 2's deluge systems. Plus, stay tuned for some interesting milestones for Starship on the Florida Space Coast, and even more test tanks at McGregor. What's up, Star People? I'm Jack Beyer for NSF, and this is your Starbase Update. Let's begin by talking about Starship's next launch, Flight 11. Last week, Ship 38 completed all pre-launch testing, with a static fire test just a few hours before the release of our previous Starbase Update episode. That static fire test had followed 2 aborted attempts on Thursday the 18th and Friday the 19th. In the attempt on the 18th, the countdown was aborted shortly after the start of propellant load. Teams had to go up to the launch mount overnight and work on the connections to the ship. On Friday the 19th, the abort occurred much later in the countdown, when most of the propellant had been loaded. This too was followed by some work over the weekend before the 3rd attempt on Monday the 22nd. You know the saying, third time's a charm, and indeed, Ship 38 fired up its 6 engines for about 10 seconds as the only engine test of its pre-launch test campaign. This is rather interesting because we had sort of gotten used to ships going for 2 engine tests ahead of launch, a single engine static fire using propellant from the header tanks, and a 6 engine static fire test. But don't be confused or think that just because the single engine static fire test was skipped, that SpaceX won't do another in-space relight demonstration on Flight 11. You see, if we go back to Ship 34, that ship also skipped a single engine static fire test, and an in-space relight with it was planned. It just never got to that point in flight, unfortunately. That single engine static fire test may just be a nice to have sort of thing, or a just in case sort of test that was probably good for extra data gathering, but not completely necessary to do ahead of flight. The reason we know the 6 engine static fire test was the only engine test for Ship 38 is the fact that she gone. That's right, it was removed from the launch mount and rolled back to Mega Bay 2. There, it sits now undergoing pre-flight checkouts and preparations ahead of launch. Thankfully, this time, unlike with Ship 37, it doesn't seem like the ship will be making a trip back to the pad. So far, the reconfiguring work on Pad 1 continues without any pauses. Hopefully, this is the last time SpaceX ever needs to do this sort of MacGyver-style stuff on a launch pad in order to test a ship. And here's a quick reminder of all the crazy work that they had to do to allow for this ship testing. First, they had to find a way to connect a ship to the launch mount. For that, they modified a ship transport stand named a square ring wall and turned it into an adapter so ships could sit on the launch mount for testing. Then they added reinforcements, they added RVAC, that's Raptor vacuum bracing mounts for the Raptor vacuum braces, they closed off the holes on the sides of the transporter with steel panels, and they grounded? They abraded the bottom of the stand so it could be welded to the launch mount. The stand doesn't get welded directly to the launch mount though. Prior to the adapter's installation, all 20 hold-down clamps are removed, each bolted to each of the hold-down arms with 3 bolts. So that's 60 bolts that have to be removed. Then, the first time around they did this, back with Ship 37, they bolted metal plates to each of the arms and then welded the adapter to those metal plates. All that just to put the ship on the mount. Then they obviously had to find a way to fill it with propellant. For that, they bypassed the existing booster lines with new ones welded to the booster quick disconnect hood. They opened holes on the hood in order to access the booster lines for this bypass. They built a truss structure to hold all the pipes, and then they used a ship quick disconnect plate they had inside Mega Bay 2 so that they could interface all of this plumbing with the ship. On top of that, they also threw a bunch of extra connections onto the mount to hook up the ship engine chill lines to the existing booster engine chill collection system on the launch mount. Thankfully, it seems some of these steps were easier for Ship 38's round of testing. The stand was already modified from when they had tested Ship 37, so all SpaceX had to do was remove the clamps and bolt it back onto the launch mount. Maybe that's why it seemed like it went so fast. The complete truss structure they built to hold the propellant lines was also removed in one piece, so putting it back together was also really easy for them as well. At least that's how it seemed from the outside. Overall, it took just a couple of weeks between Booster 15 completing static fire testing to Ship 38 completing its engine testing, significantly shorter than the month and a half of work it took in the case of Ship 37. While it was a hassle for SpaceX to do all of this, it certainly beat the alternative, which was having to wait for Massey's static fire stand to be up and running again. Now, with all the ship testing complete, Pad 1 is being returned into flight configuration, and as of the time of this recording, most of that work has in fact been completed. The next time a vehicle sits on Pad 1, it'll be Booster 15 for Flight 11. So this also means Ship 38's 6-engine static fire test was the last static fire for this configuration of Pad 1. While Pad 1 and Ship 38 are getting prepared for flight, Booster 15 was moved out of Mega Bay 1 this past week. Booster 15 completed its engine test campaign earlier this month and had been placed on the center workstation inside the bay to get it ready for launch. Since then, SpaceX has had more than enough time to work on the booster, and it's no longer needed to be inside the building. After getting evicted from Mega Bay 1, Booster 15 was moved to the rocket garden, where as of recording, it's now just sitting and waiting for Flight 11. Now, this isn't very surprising since we saw SpaceX doing the same with Booster 16 ahead of Flight 10. The booster is ready to go, so why have it in the Mega Bay occupying space when you don't need it there? We don't really expect Booster 15 to have much, if any, work done on it now that it's in the rocket garden, but there is a chance it may still have its flight termination system installed while it's waiting there. We saw the same on Booster 16 as well, so who knows? If we don't see that, maybe it was installed already inside the Mega Bay. Hopefully, we see rollout closures next week for Booster 15, given that we might be 2 weeks away from its launch. That's right, I said we may just be 2 weeks away from launch, and not because I pulled that out of thin air or wanted to reference Total Recall. This week, we started getting the first hazard notices ahead of Flight 11. On Wednesday, the U.S. Coast Guard released a local notice to mariners alerting of a rocket launch happening from the Texas coast, which was, of course, for Starship. The notice had the earliest possible launch date as October 6th, with the roughly 1-hour launch window opening at 6:15 p.m. local time, which would be 23:15 UTC. The really interesting thing is that the notice on Wednesday had October 6th as the earliest launch date, but then the notice was updated on Friday, with the dates now beginning a week later on the 13th. This would lead to a longer time between end-of-ship engine testing and the first launch attempt than what we've seen on the last couple of flights. Since there doesn't seem to be any preparations to retest Ship 38, perhaps this might just be down to further checkouts ahead of launch, especially given the fact that we now know they want to fly a much cleaner thermal protection system on the ship and perform fewer experiments on it. If I were to bet, I'd say they're probably looking over every heat shield tile, every tile gap, and everything else they can, and making sure all is in the right location, and then everything looks good to go. We also don't know if they may load Starlink simulators again, or if they'll do something else on this flight regarding Starlink satellite testing. Hopefully this time around we also see the decals being installed on the ship as well. Please, SpaceX, it doesn't hurt to put them on. We all saw how you tried to put them on Ship 37 and you didn't do it because of the rain, so please, come on, spare an hour or two and put a few stickers on Ship 38. It's really nice from a photographer's perspective to be able to differentiate ships in photos because it says what the ship is on the... Alright, I'll move on. Now, despite the bigger gap between launches than we had thought we would have, a launch on October 13th would still be a decent turnaround. It would work out to 48 days since Flight 10, which would be the fastest turnaround for a version 2 Starship by 1 day, and it would be the second fastest turnaround overall. It'll be interesting to see how long the gap will be between Flights 11 and 12, since Flight 12 will be the first launch of Starship version 3 and also the first launch from Pad 2. And it could be a sort of a long wait, as much as I hate to say. Oh, by the way, October 13th would also be the 1-year anniversary of the historic booster catch of Booster 12 on Starship's 5th flight here at Pad 1. Quite fitting, considering Booster 15 would be flying for a second time after having been caught on Flight 8, you know, second super heavy reuse and all. So, we have a no earlier than date for Flight 11, but when the first Block 3 Starship will fly on Flight 12 depends on a lot of factors. Obviously, the vehicles need to be built, and the pad has to be completed, but well before any of that, several other milestones need to be met. As you probably know, SpaceX is building and testing a whole bunch of different test tanks which aim to test different parts of the next version of booster and ship. That way, they ensure a higher chance of success on that next version, at least in theory. One of those test tanks is Booster 18.1, which contains the newly designed booster aft section, including part of the fuel transfer tube. Booster 18.1 has had 10 rounds of cryogenic testing at the Massey outpost, while being subjected to different forces applied on its structure. As we reported last week, the 10th cryogenic test seemed like it was either a test to destruction, or Booster 18.1 was damaged during the test. Either way, it didn't look great. This week, SpaceX did not test Booster 18.1 again, so it may really be it for that little fella. We'll keep an eye on it to see what they do with it, but chances are it just gets removed and sent out for scrapping. But who knows? That's why we'll be watching closely. Another one of those test tanks I just mentioned is Booster 18.3, which is testing the new forward dome and hot staging interface structure. This truss structure will replace the current hot staging ring, which is discarded before booster entry. This test tank had been rolled to Massey's last week, and between then and the time of this recording, it's performed 2 rounds of cryogenic testing. It's going to be quite weird to see a booster frosty all the way to the top, considering that the dome we'll see inside the hot staging truss is going to be the actual forward dome of the methane tank and not some extra piece of shielding like it is on version 2. The progress of construction for Booster 18 and Ship 39, the first version 3 booster and ship, depends on these test tanks performing as expected during testing. It wouldn't be surprising if, after a few more tests of Booster 18.3, we see Booster 18's forward dome section roll into Mega Bay 1 for stacking of that booster's methane tank. Don't forget, there's also a ship test tank currently in Mega Bay 2, and as you'll see later, there's even more booster test tanks set to be tested soon. I really hope we see SpaceX go through all these test tanks rather quickly and they can move on to finishing the first flight vehicles soon. I mean, surely there's just loads of hardware backed up in Star Factory awaiting stacking, but we've seen very little of said stacking happening so far. Once all of these test tanks have been qualified, I'm sure we'll start seeing barrel sections rolling out one after another like crazy, and I, for one, can't wait. Now, before we get to the Block 3 Promised Land, there's also another part of the equation that's not talked about a lot that has to be prepared for it to get built and eventually fly, and that is the mega bays themselves. The workstations, the work platforms, and all the tooling inside them was made to handle and work on version 2 boosters and version 2 ships, which means some of that will probably need changes for version 3. There's also the chance that SpaceX may want to upgrade things inside them as well. For example, in recent months, we've seen hardware to build a 4th workstation inside Mega Bay 2 for the front right corner. This would allow them to have 4 ships processed in that bay instead of 3, which could be helpful, especially once SpaceX starts catching and reusing ships. Cross your fingers that that happens next year. Closely related to this is another eviction that took place this week in Mega Bay 1, and that was Booster 12 getting removed from the back right workstation and rolled out to the rocket garden. It had been sitting there in that workstation for a few weeks, having work done on it, but it must have been complete, and now it's out. We think the work in question might have been related to preparing it to go on display somewhere around Starbase. Since there are no obvious places where a booster display may be in the works, SpaceX probably moved it to the rocket garden in the interim while they wait for said display to be complete. So all of this means that now, for the first time in, I don't know, years, the Mega Bay 1 is not hosting any complete vehicles. And once Ship 38 rolls out for flight, then that'll be the first time both bays haven't had a full vehicle inside them, which sounds crazy to think about, considering just earlier this year, they were both entirely full. A place where they're definitely getting ready for Block 3 is SpaceX's McGregor test site, which is where Raptors are test fired before making it to any vehicle. Block 3 will be using Raptor 3, so this place is kind of important for the development and then operational rollout of that engine on future test flights. Since our last McGregor Minute, which happened 2 episodes ago, SpaceX has conducted 27 Raptor firings at McGregor. Most of them were once again relight tests as SpaceX continues to torture Raptor engines at the Raptor vertical stand. One interesting pattern with this new relight testing, though, is that they seem to be firing the engine for about 2 minutes first, then it relights for about 12 seconds, and then it's relit again for about 22 seconds of burn time. It's an intriguing relight pattern as it doesn't seem to match any known part of the flight profile. The initial 2-minute burn could roughly be matched to the burn time of the engines on the booster during ascent, but when they relight for boost back, they're not on for 12 seconds, nor the 22 seconds of the second relight. It is true that for the landing burn, the center engines at least stay on for 20 to 25 seconds, but once again, the order seems kind of weird considering the previous burn on the test stand is on the order of 12 seconds. All of this is to say that we have no idea what they might be testing here other than just relighting Raptors. In the time since the last McGregor Minute, we also spotted Raptor serial number 582, the Raptor 2 with the highest serial number so far. As you can see, this is a Raptor vacuum engine, and for some weird reason, it was going in the direction of the test stands. We're not sure why it was there, but a day and a half later was a burn with a duration consistent with what we've seen before from Raptor vacuum engines. Maybe this was just a backup engine for Ship 38, since the sighting and the test happened before its static fire test, but who knows? By now, we expect that pretty much all the Raptor tests at McGregor are with Raptor 3 engines. With Flight 11 being the last flight of version 2 of Starship, that means it's also going to be the last flight of Raptor 2. One interesting thing that appeared this week at McGregor was also what we think might be yet another Block 3 booster test tank. This one, though, might just be testing the transfer tube alone. We think this because of a few reasons. The first one being that the test tank in question is not 9 meters wide. It is, in fact, about 3 meters wide. The second reason is that it has another tube inside it that is about a third of its width, so about 1 meter wide, which could correspond with a split in the fuel transfer tube. The third reason is that it was installed in the same test area where earlier this year, SpaceX tested what we think might have been another part of the next generation fuel transfer tank. The fourth and final reason is that we have in fact seen this piece of hardware before at Starbase. We saw it just a few weeks ago inside the Star Factory, and then it was transported to McGregor. The fact that it's only about 3 meters wide probably helped the transport, since it can fit through conventional roads without needing special road closures. If you remember from our last Starbase update, we mentioned it was complicated to tell how the combo of transfer tube and landing tank would work on the next generation of boosters. Frankly, even after seeing this thing at McGregor, it's still kind of hard to tell exactly how it'll work. Maybe at some point we'll have enough pieces of the puzzle to see the full picture. Ironically, this test tank area is close to where the new mystery structure is going up at McGregor. In recent weeks, it's been covered in tarps, and there are now tie-downs securing the structure as well. This is yet another huge mystery, as we have no idea what it might be for, and now, with the tarps covering it, it's going to make it even harder to guess what's going on inside. In this huge puzzle to get Block 3 to flight is, of course, Pad 2 here at Starbase, so let's talk about it next. To no one's surprise, SpaceX continued testing its deluge system once again this week. The first test of the week happened, in fact, while we were waiting for Ship 38's static fire on Monday. This one looked to be very much like the ones we covered on last week's Starbase Update episode. But then, on Wednesday, we had 2 tests in the same day, roughly 20 minutes apart. Then, there was yet another deluge test on Thursday, which happened to occur right as SpaceX was testing some of the tank farm hardware as well. So, there was a whole bunch of venting going on from that whole thing. What's rather interesting is that the deluge testing being done is using different parts of the system. The testing last week and the one earlier this week seemed like it activated either the deluge from the buckets alone or the deluge from the ridge cap placed at the top of the buckets. But at least one of the tests, the one from the 25th, looked like it was pushing the water out from both the ridge cap and the buckets at once. So this test might have been a lot closer to what we should see once the full pad is active. In the last few days, we've also seen more hardware being installed on Pad 2 for final outfitting. Such is the case with the door of the liquid oxygen booster quick disconnect, which was installed last weekend. Following that, we also saw the delivery to Sanchez of the back hoods of the booster quick disconnects. Once these are installed, both of the quick disconnect umbilicals for the next gen of boosters should be installed and ready to be closed out. For that though, we'll need to see the installation of the flex hoses that will connect the quick disconnects to the ground systems. But we may not be far from that. You may also notice that with each week, more panels are installed on the service structure and more scaffolding has disappeared from the launch mount. That's a great sign that we're getting close to it being ready to support a vehicle sooner rather than later. Something that has also appeared almost out of nowhere is the mega bunker being built at the old launch site entrance. Only last month for Flight 10, it was just a few steel columns, and now it almost looks like a medieval fortress. We're not fully sure what this is for yet. Either way, it's fortified because, well, you've got 2 launch pads that can host the world's most powerful rocket. So, probably wise to fortify this area. Pad 2 at Starbase is not the only Starship launch pad SpaceX is working on, though. In the past week, SpaceX has made a lot of progress on the Starship launch pad at Launch Complex 39A in Florida. Not only that, but they also hit a major milestone, which was installing the 2 flame bucket halves in the flame trench. On top of that, this week, the Florida Giga Bay started to rise out of the ground. So with those major milestones underway, our Florida team could not resist going for a quick photo flight to see more of this work from above. At the launch site, we can already see that one of the flame bucket halves had been installed while the other was being prepared for rigging. The flame trench wall at 39A next to the service tower is now at the level needed to put the launch mount above the trench. But that won't happen for a few more weeks. We can compare some of the work happening at 39A with what occurred at Starbase's Pad 2 to guess when some of the next major events will happen. At Pad 2, the 2 flame bucket halves were lifted and installed in the flame trench on April 12th. Then, the ridge cap connecting the 2 buckets was lifted and installed on April 24th. The launch mount was then rolled out to the pad a few weeks later and finally lifted and installed at the pad on May 12th, just 30 days after the buckets were installed. This means that by this time next month, we should see the 39A launch mount rolled out and maybe even installed, provided that all these milestones happen at the same pace as Pad 2. The aerial views also gave us a great look at what exactly was rising from the ground at the Giga Bay area. Teams have started to assemble the pieces that will make up the center wall that will be running in between the 2 transfer aisles. We can also see that one of the 4 tower cranes is already in operation and a second one is being assembled just to the south of that one. It'll be super interesting to see how much different the Giga Bay will look compared to the existing mega bays here in Starbase. I'm sure they've learned a ton about how to make one and how to optimize these sorts of structures for production. At SpaceX's Roberts Road operations area, our team also caught the delivery of pieces for the methane booster quick disconnect hood. That's the one with the weird protuberance going down the side of the launch mount. These parts are for that exact section that sticks down to the side of the launch mount to protect all of the delicate bits of hardware in that area. Neat! It's pretty incredible to think that not long from now, we may see 2 Starship launch pads up and running. I don't know about you, but I'm really excited just thinking about it. When do you think we may see a flight from Pad 2 or from 39A? You know the drill. Let us know in the comments. Of course, then there's the fact we may be within 2 weeks of Flight 11, so as sad as it is to say goodbye to the current version of Starship, it's still a Starship launch. We might see some updates from SpaceX in the next week or so hopefully we get to feature that on the next Starbase Update episode. But until then, that's pretty much all there is for this week. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget, be excellent to each other.